Greetings, friends and listeners. I'd like to welcome you to a new episode of the segment I like to call Unauthorized and Explicit Readings. Returning once again to Alan Watts and his book, The Way of Zen. All disclaimers previously presented in earlier episodes apply, but for the essence of time, I shall not recite them. On page 7, in the middle of the first chapter, titled The Philosophy of Tao, he's talking about language and words, as curiously I was just discussing in a previous episode. Words, 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 as Shakespeare said. He's talking about how we develop conventions and symbols, and that we, as individuals, identify ourselves with an equally conventional view of, quote, myself. And he says, for the conventional self or person is comprised mainly of history, consisting of selected memories and beginning from the moment of parturition. He continues, thus, communication by conventional signs of this type, meaning language, especially in the Western world, which, as you may be familiar, the English language is very linear. Communicating in conventional signs of this type gives us an abstract, one-at-a-time translation of a universe in which things are happening altogether at once. A universe whose concrete reality always escapes perfect description in these abstract terms. I want to pause here. I think that statement shoots right to the core of sort of one of the loopholes in humanity and our shared mental constructs that are being taken advantage of in our current day and age. I'll let you connect those dots in your own terms. I shall return to Watts on page 8. The perfect description of a small particle of dust by these means would take an everlasting time, since one would have to account for every point in its volume. That sentence is not only eloquent, it goes as proof to speak towards his deep understanding of both the material world, physics, and how our mind works, and how those two things are in opposition in a way. Essentially, what he's saying with that statement is that our abstractions are filters so specific that they fail to describe that which they are abstracted from. Or if you choose to think of them as verbs or as actions, that which they are abstracting. They fail to describe it in perfection, and yet we strive for perfection. He continues on page 8. The linear, one-at-a-time character of speech and thought is particularly noticeable in all languages using alphabets, representing experience in long strings of letters. It is not easy to say why we must communicate with others, and in brackets he types speak, and with ourselves, in brackets he has think, by this one-at-a-time method. That is a deep and powerful question, is it not? Why do we narrate to ourselves and to each other our phenomenological experience using these admittedly very dynamic, very fluid, and at times quite, eloquent, but ultimately limited and short-sighted systems of symbols that we call language? Why? Why should it be such a thing? He continues, life itself does not proceed in this cumbersome, linear fashion, and our own organism could hardly live for a moment if they had to control themselves by taking thought of every breath, every beat of the heart, and every neural impulse. Could you imagine occupying your time thinking out in English sentences, or in insert your favorite language, sentences constructed out of the ordinary alphabet, the one we all are familiar, the one I'm using, the kind of thing I'm doing now, talking to you, and having to organize and orchestrate and personally conduct the orchestration of everything that's happening inside my body, inside your body? Believe it or not, you are quite busy at the cellular level. Whether you're meditating or jogging or going to work or taking a shower or taking a poop, your cells are righteously busy. And I don't know why that word came out that way, but it sounds cool, I guess. They are really, truly righteously busy. By that I mean they are doing things which we, the sentence talkers, the persons that we call ourselves us, can't even conceive of how to do. Can you explain in English or in Korean or in whatever language is your native tongue how your body does what your body does? Can you even describe the total volume of what you understand about your body and what it's capable of? Of course not. And I don't ask that to be rude. I'm not putting you down. I'm just pointing out how deep this passage goes and what significant impact it would have if it suddenly were to be different. Or if we were to probe that, I continue with what he has to say. I'm skipping ahead a bit. There is then an analogy, and perhaps more than mere analogy, between central vision and conscious, one at a time thinking, and between peripheral vision and the rather mysterious process which enables us to regulate the incredible complexity of our bodies without thinking at all. It should be noted further that we call our bodies complex as a result of trying to understand them in terms of linear thought of words and concepts. But the complexity is not so much in our bodies as in the task of trying to understand them by this means of thinking. It is like trying to make out the features of a large room with no other than a light made up of a single bright ray. He continues on page 9. In this respect, the Chinese language has a slight advantage over our own and is perhaps symptomatic of a different way of thinking. Now, why does he suddenly approach? Well, of course, he's explaining to us Taoism. And I want to get to an interesting thing on the following page. It is still linear and is still a series of abstractions taken one at a time, but its written signs are a little closer to life, and spelled words, because they are essentially pictures, and as a Chinese proverb puts it, one showing's worth 100 sayings. Compare, for example, the ease of showing someone how to tie a complex knot with the difficulty of telling him how to do it in words alone. Now, here's the funny part. And again, I say to you, he's attacking, or he's exploring something which I think it is important for us to understand is being exploited about us today by the system of oppression, which is why I feel it's important to read to you this passage. Now, continuing with his text. Now, the general tendency of the Western mind, that's you and me, those of us who speak English, and, whatever, those of us who do not think in Taoist terms, for example, or in mystical terms of the Far East, the tendency of the Western mind is to feel that we do not really understand what we cannot represent, what we cannot communicate by linear signs, by thinking. We are like the wallflower who cannot learn to dance unless someone draws him a diagram of the steps, who cannot get it by feel. For some reason, and he leaves it up to us to discover what that reason may or may not be. And thus, I suggest to you I'm laying out a meta thesis about some of what that reasoning might be amongst those we would call the oppressors. But I digress. For some reason, we do not trust and do not fully use the peripheral vision of our minds. He goes on to give an example of how that works, but I'm going to skip ahead. We are not suggesting that Westerners simply do not use the peripheral mind. Being human, we use it all the time, and every artist, every workman, every athlete calls into play some special development of its powers. But it is not academically and philosophically, or dare I add to his words, politically or ideologically respectable. For some reason. I wonder what that reason might be. Foreshadowing. Continuing with Mr. Watts's words, we have hardly begun to realize its possibilities, and it seldom, if ever, occurs to us that one of the most important uses for it, for that, quote, knowledge of reality. Let me pause here. Knowledge of reality is something that they do not teach you in school. It's quite the opposite. The entire agenda of post-World War II academics is nothing to do with understanding reality. Although, like with patriotism, we sometimes describe it in terms that seem sympathetic to that. But give me a PhD. Well, I digress. It is that its most important use is for that knowledge of reality, which we try to attain by the cumbersome calculations of theology, metaphysics, and logical inference. Now, mind you, that's exactly what he is doing and what I am doing by reading these words that he wrote, right? So let's not get too self-celebratory here. He continues because he is, of course, the driving point here is to give us an entrance, an entrée, as the French would say, into some cultural understanding of what both Confucianism and Taoism is. And why is this important? You hopefully shall be able to draw conclusions for yourself. When we turn to ancient Chinese society, don't get hung up on talking about Chinese society, okay? This is not the same thing as postmodern Chinese society. And I don't want to get into a socio-political, geopolitical debate there about that at this time. When we turn to ancient Chinese society, we find two philosophical traditions playing complementary parts: Confucianism and Taoism. Generally speaking, the former concerns itself with the linguistic, ethical, legal, and ritual conventions which provides society with its systems of communication. Confucianism, in other words, preoccupies itself with conventional knowledge. And under its auspices, children are brought up so that their originally wayward and whimsical natures are made to fit the Precrustian bed of the social order. The individual defines himself and his place in society in terms the Confucius formula. Now, they were really quite self-aware people. Forget what you think you know about Chinese society. And forget what you might think you know about any of this, really. And just look at it in the perspective of how it operates here today in our society. This ancient society, Chinese or whatever, had a system for helping you fit in to the social order. Well, we sort of have that, but it's very disorganized, isn't it? We don't really know where it's coming from. I guess, does it come from religion? Does it come from politics? Does it come from some confluence of both? We generally just call it family values and drop the mic, but Who has any consensus or agreement on what family values actually is? So put a pin in that.